I think there's enough spirituality just in appreciating a walk in a forest or jumping into a waterfall or just having a great empathic experience. We have a kind of formal morality in society which says racism is wrong, sexism is wrong. But our popular culture still very much promotes the view that it's acceptable to discriminate on the grounds of appearance. The lesson that I see from the Second World War is all about difference and otherness. And we're still doing that. We're still otherizing.
Hey, Richard, how are you?
I'm really good. It's good to be here. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure to get to talk to you. And also, congratulations on the book. Yeah, it's wonderful to have that out in the world, and hopefully it's getting a good reception, the climate crisis and other animals. And we have quite a few mutual links, because I know you're chair of the Vegan Society's research committee, and without really realizing it, I've been working through quite a few of your committee members in previous episodes as well. So people like Coralie Wren and Josh Milburn and Alex Lockton and so on. I think there's about 7 or 8. Kim Stallwood, Christoph Don, Chris Bryant. Yeah, and hopefully there's some future guests in that list too. So you know this already, but I guess it's a series of conversations about what I think of as the deepest philosophical questions, and ones that most of humanity still gets wrong. Basic questions of how do we understand the universe and reality, what's real and what's true, but just as importantly, the foundational questions of ethics. And while sentientism itself is quite pluralistic, it focuses on this question of moral scope, who gets to be included, this question of who matters. And there's an obvious bias, clearly, because I have an agenda, because I'm trying to popularize and develop sentientism as this really basic, pluralistic, but still radical worldview that answers those questions by saying we should use evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So the evidence and reason is a broadly naturalistic way of understanding the world, and compassion for all sentient beings says that at least every sentient being, every being that has the capacity to feel, to experience, however basic those experiences might be, should matter seriously in our moral consideration, not just in a tokenistic way either. But I'm talking in these conversations, as you know, to people, some of whom agree and some of whom don't. So it'll be really interesting to dig into your philosophical journey and how that plays into the work you do now. But before we get on to those big questions, how would you best introduce yourself and the work you do?
Yeah, I'm a sociologist. I guess as academics, we're encouraged to kind of tie our identity to one discipline. But in my journey, it's been other things too. It's been philosophy and psychology and history and also into the natural sciences as well. Like my first book was about biotechnology. So that's my kind of disciplinary kind of identity, if you like. And it's my, I'm a reader in sociology at Edgehill University, which is near Liverpool. And I co-direct also a Centre for Human Animal Studies at the same university, which is a really rewarding part of the job. Yeah, I mean, I think probably other things will emerge in the conversation. My part of my journey was essentially being the 1990s were my decade of studying. So I was an undergraduate, then master's, and then PhD, and then that was my time in space to kind of discover things. And undergraduate kind of getting into ecofeminist stuff and reading Val Plumwood and Carol J. Adams, and then later engaging with the kind of the Regans and the singers and so on. But really sort of following that journey, and then following the emergence of critical animal studies later, round about 2005, when that kind of got explicitly outlined in the States, and how that's kind of how I've contributed to that, and how that's kind of changed in its journey of the last, nearly 20 years. So that's the kind of basics, but I'm sure lots more will come out as we...
Yeah, I'm sure it will. Thank you. And I find the critical animal studies space and your own perspective interesting, because in a way, there's 2 big themes that I guess will come through the conversation, in that humanity haltingly, slowly, does seem to be waking up to, for example, the animal question, starting to recognize that it's not just all about us humans and the ideas of the animal turn, and the shift happening in various different domains of human endeavor and academia. And it's also haltingly, painfully, too slowly, starting to wake up to the environmental crisis and the climate crisis as well. And in a way, I guess what you're trying to do with critical animal studies, with many others, is say, well, okay, it's great you're starting to wake up, but there's problems in the way you've woken up, right? And there's a criticism of even those movements and a suggestion about a very different way forward. So yeah, it'll be interesting to sort of explore how you make those two challenges to those sort of partial flawed awakenings, if you like.
Yeah, the flawed awakenings is an interesting and probably good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's start with the first of these crazily deep philosophical questions, the question of what's real. And for many guests, a good way into that is to understand their journey with respect to religion, the supernatural, and whether they grew up in a family or society that, was strongly influenced by the spiritual, the supernatural, the religious, or maybe one that was maybe more naturalistic or atheist agnostic, maybe more scientifically minded, or a mix of the two, and how that side of their thinking about some of those big questions about the nature of reality have shifted over time, if they have. And how do you think about that stuff today?
Absolutely. So both my parents were socialists, and that was the kind of household that I grew up in. I grew up in, essentially. I mean, it wasn't like rammed down my throat, but it was essentially not a religious household. It was implicitly an atheist household. I always chuckle a little bit because they had one friend who was a Christian socialist, and they allowed myself and my sister to be taken to Sunday school for a while, which I always sort of found, why are you doing that? I think they just wanted me and my sister out of the house. But yeah, I was like...
Do you remember what you thought of Sunday school when you went there?
It didn't have any effect. It was just another space to play. So that didn't have any effect. But I was aware that, there were religious people around me in that very narrow sense of Christianity. And then even I had a school teacher probably when I was about, I would say probably eight or nine, and she was quite religious and made us recite the Lord's Prayer at the start of every day. So that was odd, but I think in some ways that kind of drove me away from religion. And in secondary school, I basically got the exemption. I spoke to my mum and said, could you get me out of religious education because I don't want that, which is kind of, probably sociologically limited, because it's actually really good to learn about religion and to understand it. But for me, I'd already knew that wasn't something that I wanted to kind of, spend my time doing. So I got the exemption, then I could just go in the library when everybody else was doing religious education. So it's given me a kind of materialist outlook, I guess. And so, yeah, I believe, that when we die and we ideally kind of, decompose and feed the rest of nature, which I think is that's a kind of beautiful thing, really. So I don't believe in an afterlife. And at the same time, I don't think I'm dogmatic about it. I'm interested in people who talk about near-death experiences. And so I do sometimes listen into those. And I know that when people lose somebody and that they're grieving, they report strange experiences. So I'm open-minded, but my first inclination is that it's quite a materialist understanding of existence. And, really, I'm kind of on board with that aspect of the sentientism in terms of, reason and evidence. But I would also add that my atheism isn't simplistically kind of rationalistic atheism. It's probably got elements of romanticism in it as well. So I guess like Shelley, for example, and that kind of, the beauty and wonder of nature giving us some kind of meaningfulness in our lives. And so the idea that, well, that's enough. Why do we need to construct this afterlife? And clearly, there's a poor track record with religiosity and conservative ideology. So that's another thing that has distanced me from it, and the way in which it's been used to justify patriarchy, anthropocentrism, colonialism, etc., capitalism, etc.
That's an interesting journey. Thank you. Yeah. One thing that I find interesting is, and my only thinking has shifted on this a little bit over time, is that I guess the word naturalism can be used in a bunch of different ways. But one is about ontology, which is, is the natural world all that exists? So, it's basically a view that supernatural stuff doesn't exist. And I give that pretty high credence myself. But I think, as you were saying, we should still not get dogmatic about it and be open-minded about the possibility of even weird or strange or unexplained stuff. There might be stuff we don't know about and might never be able to properly understand. So I think that open-mindedness is important, because sometimes people with a naturalistic way of thinking get like too dogmatic and closed-minded. And that's the antithesis of a good naturalistic approach, to my mind, because by definition, if you're going to be grounding your credences in evidence and reasoning, then if the evidence changes, then your view should change as well. And if you're 100% confident, then you basically stop thinking. So I like that open-mindedness, even to sort of weird ontological stuff too. And I've focused more on the epistemology and the toolkit and the...
I would make an additional dimension to that. I kind of recently outed myself as having a hobbyist interest in UFOs and UAPs.
Oh, yeah.
Which actually stems from my childhood. In my childhood, I subscribed to a magazine called The Unexplained, which was all about supernatural and UFO type things. So I suppose I've always had that interest, but ultimately, give me some evidence kind of thing. I think it's healthy to kind of make skepticism your default. But in recent years, clearly there's been some interesting goings on in terms of people making claims around the existence of non-human intelligence, and also lots of delicious conspiracy theories around cover-ups, and a big movement now for kind of disclosure of UFOs and that kind of thing. So I'm skeptical, but I'm fascinated, and I kind of outed myself in the sense that at the turn of the year, I wrote a blog on our research centre's website called, I think it was called Aliens, UFOs, and Critical Animal Studies. So what I was doing, I was making links between the idea of, if there was to be a disclosure of non-human intelligence, be that in the form of extraterrestrial or what's called crypto-terrestrial, in terms of life that's kind of hidden on Earth that we've just not been aware of, or indeed maybe only just like could be microbial life discovered on Mars or something like that. So what interested me about that was to talk about it in terms of post-humanism, and how post-humanism historically has been concerned with how the human has become decentered in lots of different ways, and how this would be a fundamental new kind of decentering. So yeah, it's a fun little article that I wrote on our research center, CFAS, the research center that I co-direct, and we've got a little blog page. So so I think that kind of, that's another example of how I'm open to different ideas of reality, other dimensions, other forms of life that we've not discovered yet. But at the same time, maybe it's just Earth, and maybe there isn't anything else. So I'm open to all different sort of permutations on that.
That makes sense. I mean, the universe is a pretty big place, so who knows? And the other openness I liked, which is, again, can be a risk with naturalism, that some people take this sort of evidence and reason thing in a very narrow sort of scientistic way. So that they'll say, well, the only valid evidence is randomized controlled trials or double blind. It has to be some guy in a lab coat. It's like, well, no, that's not what I mean by evidence, and I don't think that's what naturalism means by evidence too. There's the evidence from our own senses. There's the evidence from our own experiences and our own life courses, which can be, radically different, which I think leaves plenty of room for more of the critical perspective you take, which does recognize the importance of positionality and perspective. And all of those things are part, I think, of a richly naturalistic worldview, as is stuff like, romantic aesthetic appreciation for things, right? That, technically and scientifically, maybe my appreciation of a beautiful landscape is a pattern of firing in my brain, but that doesn't take the meaning and the value out of it. That's, the value of that experience is deep and rich and powerful and really important. And taking a really narrow scientific approach that sort of tries to crush any of the romance or aesthetics or subjectivity out of the world is another form of quite damaging dogma. So I quite like keeping this naturalism idea, and the idea of types of evidence is very broad, but applying that healthy skepticism to it. So the other point you made was about the link between some of these religious worldviews and patriarchy, hierarchy, supremacism, outgroup othering, anthropocentrism. And that's another interesting journey that some of my guests have taken, where they've maybe that's been part of the rationale too. So for some, it's been more of an evidence and reason thing. I just don't think the evidence stacks up, and it doesn't feel like the Bible or the Quran. It feels like they're fabrications rather than deep truths, right? They're human-made rather than deistic. But they've moved away from those Abrahamic religions and either moved towards some of the more dharmic religions or a broader spirituality, because they want to maintain that connection with the transcendent, but do it in a way that does recognize a more sort of ecocentrically connected, humans are slightly decentered, in a slightly different way. But it feels like you've followed, like me, just followed a more sort of materialist, naturalistic track of, understanding the world while remaining open-minded about the possibility of other stuff.
It's been quite interesting because I got into ecofeminism in the early 90s. I had to navigate my way through that because a big strand of ecofeminism was very much spiritualist ecofeminism.
Yeah.
And I didn't like it. I thought it's just like I have the skepticism of all spirituality for two reasons. Firstly, I feel that it turns a politics into a personal identity project. And I find that just like really quite egocentric. And secondly, it's, spirituality is a great way in which capitalism commodifies people's belief systems. And it's, there's a big business, isn't it? Spirituality. So I'm just, I think there's enough spirituality just in appreciating, a walk in a forest or jumping into a waterfall, things that I love doing like that, or just having a great empathic experience with something that has a face.
Yeah, thank you. And I agree on the commercialization of spirituality. There's another podcast recommendation you may have come across it already called Conspirituality.
No, I've not heard that one.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I'd recommend them even more highly if they weren't so determinedly anthropocentric, which is always a frustration. But regardless, their analysis of that space is really interesting because they're very familiar with it. They've lived in it and they've actually got a lot of value from it. But then they've also seen some of the dark sides in their own lives. And they now do a brilliant deconstruction and analysis of the problems there. And that portmanteau word conspirituality, I think, sort of sums up some of the risks. So, there's value there, but there's also plenty of red flags and dangers. And in a way, that's partly why some people will say, look, well, why are you trying to put this naturalistic way of understanding the world into the sentientism worldview? Shouldn't you just focus on a sentiocentric compassion? Isn't that really what matters? And part of the reason is because I think naturalism gives us our best chance of understanding the world. And if we want to make the world better, understanding it accurately is pretty useful. So it's less likely to lead us astray, but it doesn't guarantee we'll be right. But it is also because of those ethical red flags that seem to bubble up quite frequently in supernatural or spiritual or religious ways of thinking that can lead even quite compassionate people to do terrible things, because they're just wrong about the world. So that's partly why I'm quite keen for it to be both. And one interesting analog to that in a worldview, which does a similar sort of thing, I guess, is humanism, which commits to a sort of naturalistic understanding of the world and insists that we don't need a deity or the supernatural to be moral. We as humans, as human agents, can choose to be moral. I guess that's the essence of it. I saw a tweet of yours, which I think was responding to one of the annual censuses or one of the censuses that's done in the UK, where you said something like, I'll be taking no religion, but obviously not a humanist, which I thought was
Yeah, that might be the first time that I've been called out on a tweet. That's really interesting. Yeah. Yeah. I guess maybe when I was a lot younger, I would have identified with humanism, but part of my journey has been distancing myself from humanism, even though, clearly there are strands in humanist thought that I do relate to, such as the atheistic side. But for me, humanism has been too tied to the anthropocentric ideology. And that's why, alongside critical animal studies, I've, become more interested in post-humanism as a whole wide range of tools to decenter the human. And it's interesting though, because as the world seems to keep regressing in various ways, violence, for example, that you could argue the need for humanism keeps being recycled because we keep having atrocities and so on, and so that kind of calls for a reaffirmation of the value of the human.
Yeah, it's not like it's not like most countries signed up to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and now we're done, right?
I don't think we've learned the lesson from the Second World War yet.
No.
The lesson that I see from the Second World War is all about difference and otherness, and we're still doing that. We're still otherizing whatever that might be, Muslims or women or whatever. So I feel 80 years later, we've not really learned from that, and that's why we're kind of stuck. There are people like us that are saying, well, let's maybe transition to a more post-humanist awareness, but we keep getting dragged back into the need to reaffirm.
Yeah, and one challenge that some people will lay out to us will be to say, well, okay, because of these problems in the intrahuman sphere, we've sort of got to double down on those first. Don't worry, we'll get to you later. It's like, well, and I frankly just don't buy that, because I think many of the and we'll come on to this too, many of the intrahuman problems are partly related to the othering mindset that excludes the beyond human as well. So in a way, I think, maybe naively, that a post-humanist approach or a sentientist approach gives us a better chance of addressing the intrahuman challenges as well. It's not, moving on from those, it's addressing the whole lot. And in a way, what I've been trying to do with sentientism, in a way, is a response to that anthropocentrism of humanism. And maybe it's it's a specific form of post-humanism that doesn't even have the word human in it, which I find quite refreshing. And it's trying to play that different role that breaks anthropocentrism. It doesn't have the anthropocentric bias or the baggage or some of the Eurocentric baggage that can sometimes come along with humanism too, and maybe sets out a different path. And I don't want to be too harsh on humanism, because I do think it's changing, and there are people in the humanist movements that are trying to shift it. I think it's entirely fair to say that its center of gravity is still overwhelmingly anthropocentric, and it's also quite narrowly focused on resisting religious privilege. But there are people within the movement who will say to you, well, the human in humanism doesn't mean we should only care about humans. It means that we as humans get to choose our ethics. So some of the humanist organizations now have actually updated their definitions, you might argue slightly tokenistically, to include things like, and a concern for non-human sentient beings. So Humanists International in the UK have at least added a line in there. Now, it hasn't changed their content, it hasn't changed their priorities, it hasn't changed their focus, it hasn't changed most of what they do or say. So it's a work in progress. But in a way, that's quite a challenge to humanism, because if they can't fix that, they've become another dogma, right? And the whole point of humanism is supposed to be learning from evidence and reason and humility and open-mindedness and making progress. So if they get stuck with anthropocentrism, then I would argue they're betraying their own humanism. So I'm both setting out an alternative, but also I'm trying to push humanism itself to shift so that I could imagine it overlapping more with sentientism as time goes on. So.
Yeah, I mean, the human is unstable, and so it's contested, and we're involved. Our community is involved in trying to push a particular definition of the human based on empathy and humility and so on and so forth. But I guess like a core belief of areas like critical animal studies and ecofeminism are that the question of the animal is central to the question of racism, the question of classism, the question of sexism. And so, those dogmatic humanists would learn a lot, I think, from engaging with that body of work. And that, so many people have written up on this. I've been writing on it for like 20 plus years, that, the animalization of the human is an integral part of understanding the oppression of intrahuman relations.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think many of those, you have to go back too far in time, and there are still some of them now who would talk about the human, exclude many or even most members of the Homo sapiens species from that designation of the human, because the human, the ideal model human, implicitly or explicitly, was a certain type of human, right? And it excluded many Homo sapiens from that model. And then even in some of the supposedly progressive thinking about trying to address that problem, the outreach was somewhat patronizing. Sometimes the message to women or people of color or, or others who are considered outside of the human, we're then told, well, if you civilize, if you become more like us, if you match our pattern, then we might let you into the club. So that dynamic, even around the definition and the use of the word human, has been used brutally, even against other humans for a long time. So I think that's another part of the reason why we need to, break it and going beyond the human, and also hope that ideas like sentientism can actually help to address some of those intrahuman challenges as well, rather than replicating them. There's a lot of baggage there.
Yeah, I just think that critical animal work offers so much to critical thinking and critical theory generally. And we need to do a better job of getting our message out there. There's the anthropocentrism and its practitioners are very good at resisting these arguments, because if you take on those arguments, then they have to fundamentally revisit our ethical treatment of other animals. And so, I just think that remains the huge sticking point for, I see this in the academy because I'm surrounded by presumably intelligent people who've all, gained PhDs, but their understanding of intersectionality stops at the human-animal boundary. So if presumably intelligent people measured in terms of PhDs, if that's a measure of intelligence, I don't know. If they can be resistant, then it's very difficult to to transition to a new paradigm. But that's the struggle that we're engaged with.
It is, and we'll come back to that in the final question as well when we think about how to shift us towards a better world. So, these boundaries always blur, but I guess the second deep question we ask is about the foundations of ethics and what matters. So again, I'd be interested in your, personal journey, even from, a kid onwards, about how did you first think about good and bad and right and wrong? What do these terms even mean? And how that's changed over your life? And how do you think about that now, in a critical studies space? There's so much to consider there about power and oppression and justice and freedom and autonomy and suffering and the value of a life and rights. There's such a panoply of different things you can consider in that ethics space. And I guess I'm interested in what's at the root of that for you, if there is such a thing as a grounding, or is it more messy? Anyway, that's a crazy compound question, but hopefully you can make some sense out.
I think a sociologist would definitely want to grab hold of the messiness sort of label. I don't know. I think as a child, I probably was interested in trying to kind of work these things out. And I had a cat growing up, so that probably sensitized me to other species and that kind of thing. And I remember maybe age 15, 16, developing some kind of environmental awareness. So, Chernobyl happened when I was 12 or something. So I guess that was quite a big impact. And also kind of not really relating to other, you begin to understand how gender is playing out in your surroundings, and kind of, even though I was into, some typical gendered things, I was going to football matches and things like that, I wasn't really relating to the kind of normative masculinity that was obviously never language that I would retrospectively, but there was some kind of wasn't really relating to that. And I think that definitely followed me through into adulthood, which I then found academic expression for. So that all touches upon morality. But
and in those early days, did you get a sense of, if you can remember, what was underneath that? Was it about empathy for the experiences or the suffering of others? Was it about a sense of injustice and others doing wrong, or fairness, or is there something else, do you think, that was sitting underneath that? Because people have different ways into it. Sometimes it's quite a sort of intellectual thing about justice and fairness and actions we take, and for others it's more of an empathic, maybe emotional connection with others and a feeling for others, or something else.
Yeah, I think probably it was a bit of anger, injustice. I was quite a young anti-racist. I remember sort of finding out about the civil rights movement, and I guess my parents made sure that I found out about social inequality. I guess we got during the 80s, both my parents worked. My dad was an academic, my mom was a teacher. So we kind of became more middle class throughout the 80s, I guess, but never like, super wealthy or anything. So yeah, all those different sort of types of injustices became apparent to me, and just sort of, sensing the kind of, paralogical discriminating on appearance. Like I got this big sort of something I really wanted to pursue, like this idea of judging by appearance. And so that was informed by kind of anti-racism, but kind of other things as well. Like I ended up doing like an undergraduate dissertation on like body image and body esteem, and just sort of sensing that there was a kind of unjust, and this is kind of something that still falls through the cracks of contemporary society. So we have a kind of formal morality in society which says racism is wrong, sexism is wrong, etc., etc. But our popular culture still very, very much promotes the view that probably promotes the view that it's acceptable to discriminate people on the grounds of their appearance. And so that was something that really kind of energized me.
Some people call it lookism.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if that's the right term for it. But
the way I got into it in undergrad was to look at the pseudosciences of phrenology and physiognomy, which were quite big back in the 18th and 19th centuries, where there was this belief that you could judge somebody's character through their facial expressions, and especially in the physiognomy side. And so one of my first publications, I think it was in 2002, was looking at the history of physiognomy, and me trying to kind of make the case, well, actually, this is often looked back upon as a kind of irrational episode in Western history, where, people would carry these little pocket guides and they'd have illustrations of people's faces. And so as life became more urbanized, people wanted to have that reassurance of being able to judge the character of these people that they were encountering. So they would say, oh, this person has this particular shaped nose or this particular shaped eyebrows, therefore they are that kind of, they're bad people or they're good people. This kind of thing.
Yeah.
So, I kind of got into that idea, and I guess I've left that behind a little bit, but that kind of sociology of the body kind of work, which looks at things like that, is still of interest to me. I think, these things just sort of, lots of layers added on, and then, reading Val Plumwood's book, Feminism and the Mastery of Nature, which looks at the history of Western dualism, that was a really important kind of encounter for me. And then exploring lots of environmental philosophy during the 1990s, and then eventually, animal philosophy and animal ethics as well.
Injustice seems to be quite central to you, as you said, in all its forms. I guess the second part of this question is the one about who matters, because one of my deep frustrations with moral philosophy as a field, but also obviously human culture, is that so much conversation about morality and ethics just even unthinkingly just assumes the subject matter is humans. It's just like so overwhelming. I was saying to a guest yesterday, I've got a book downstairs that's 650 pages long called Ethics, and the word animal doesn't even exist. It's not in the index. It's not it just doesn't, not even thought of as a topic, right? So that's partly why I focus so hard on this question of moral scope and who gets included, almost regardless of which ethical system you apply. And you talked about an early experience with a family cat, maybe as one of the early trigger points. But it would be really interesting to know your story on that ethical scope question, whether it was, both within humanities, you think about friends and family, and then no doubt influenced by your parents, thinking more broadly than that about the different forms of injustice and more different and more distant humans, but also that critical question of non-humans, and how did you come to realize they mattered, and how did you work that through your life?
So in 1992, when I was a first-year undergraduate, I went vegetarian, which, funnily enough, in the 1990s, that was seen as, that was it. That was the kind of, veganism wasn't a vocabulary, really. I mean, we have to give a lot of credit to those people who were vegan then in the 90s and even the 80s. But it wasn't like, veganism wasn't really socially intelligible back then. But 92, went vegetarian, and that, it was kind of alongside the kind of reading that I was doing, like, the sexual politics of meat, such things, and then, encountering animal ethics work.
And again, was that motivated by the injustice of animal exploitation, or because of an empathic connection with its victims, or a mixture of both? Or
my animal ethics were like always environmental at the same time. So when I then discovered within environmental philosophy that there was this big schism between animal ethics and environmental ethics, it was quite odd to me. I mean, I don't deny that there are conflicts around that, but yeah, it just seemed to me that it was a strange separation. And even today, and within the most recent book, making the argument that, you know, people who self-define as vegans for the animals and don't sort of, and use that to separate themselves off from environmental vegans, I just find that a wholly incoherent viewpoint. And I, you know, anybody who reads the book will hopefully realize how incoherent that is. I think I read Ecofeminist Animal Ethics before I read Singer and Regan. And so I was already reading their critiques of overly rationalistic animal ethics. So,
and was that was taking a more of a care relational approach to it? Or
the whole care ethics literature, I wouldn't say 100% like found that satisfying either, but I thought it was important to kind of say that emotions which have historically been feminized, be that care, empathy, compassion, it's so important to kind of redress that, because, you know, one of the reasons that we don't see a vegan society is that masculinity is understood in terms of disavowing emotions such as empathy and compassion, and it's still
criticized as sentimental. And
there's sentimentalism attached to it as well. And then back to your earlier point about, you know, how can you think about animal ethics when we have to address the human issues first? So all that kind of silly arguments about ordering, definitely a combination of them both. And then went down that path of like, you know, reading, you know, well, we can have animal ethics based on ideas of similarity, we can have animal ethics based on ideas of difference, and maybe we can come up with something else as well. You know, we can go through all the different, you know, utilitarianism, deontology, virtue ethics, care ethics, and which was all really fascinating to me. And I ended up, you know, through my job, like meeting Tom Regan, asking Peter Singer a difficult question at a conference, which he didn't answer very well, about capitalism.
I don't know if you've seen my interview with it, but
oh no, I haven't. No,
yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, again, some difficult patches, but a fascinating conversation.
Well, I asked Peter Singer if he thought that, you know, capitalism was important to problematize in terms of exploitation, and he oddly enough, he said no, it wasn't really, and he was pushing back against a kind of anti-capitalist view, which, you know, I think there's a big gap between critical animal studies and Peter Singer's perspective. And then like, you know, meeting a lot of those ecofeminist writers that I was reading in the 90s, later meeting and getting to know like Carol Day Adams and Greta Gard. You know, I'm not saying this just a name drop, but it was just like a kind of quite a profound experience to kind of meet those people that I'd been reading, and then just sort of appreciating the way in which we can reflect upon different ethical theories, and maybe understand how different ethical theories might be reproducing certain relations of power without intending to. But when I met Tom Regan, he was very, you know, I think he knew that I had some interest and had published on ecofeminism. I met him in 2006, and he sat me down, and he was very keen to understand the criticisms that ecofeminists have been making of his work, and that he was quite upset by them, I think. I don't think he accepted that his framework was like overly rationalistic and that kind of thing. And, you know, I really enjoyed meeting him, and I'm more sympathetic to a properly animal rights perspective. In his work, I'm more sympathetic to Regan than I am to Singer. And I'd probably argue that there's more of a closeness between ecofeminist approaches and Regan than there is between ecofeminist approaches and Singer, but there are definitely those differences as well. And then further, I get another layer to that, I suppose, is as essentially as a sociologist, kind of later only partly rejecting even the importance of philosophical ethical frameworks, because ultimately, from my perspective as a sociologist, these these don't matter to people. People don't formulate their practices by making reference to ethical theories. And I think it's a mistake in which we over-rationalize the human to think that they would. You know, the way in which people's human-animal relations form are very habitual, and it's more about being socialized into various social norms and conforming to those norms, and the sociological reasons why they conform to those norms. So I kind of wanted to create a space for sociology and other, because I think within the sort of academic questioning of human-animal relations, philosophy has historically been seen as the most important dominant discipline. And so I've wanted to kind of push back on that. But I did, in the early part of my career, when I was a postdoc, I engaged quite a lot with the field of bioethics. And what I did there was to criticize the field of bioethics in a few different journal articles, and also in my first book, actually, to say that basically bioethics is very anthropocentric. It excludes non-human animals. And, it was quite an easy criticism to make, but really nobody had been making that criticism back in 2003 or so. Yeah, that was like an early phase. And I moved on from that. It was partly because the professor I was working with at the time was a big name in bioethics, Ruth Chadwick. So yeah, I definitely sort of wanted to kind of try to, I guess, make clear the ways in which different ethical theories are problematic, be that, they ignore animals or they include animals, but do it in a way in which might be reinstigating problematic assumptions around what the human is. In other words, like overly rationalizing the human and not giving due space to emotional aspects of human-animal relations or sociological aspects of human-animal relations.
Yeah. Thank you. No, that's fascinating. Yeah. And back to this question of, I guess, moral scope, it's very clear you rejected anthropocentrism and want to go beyond that to consider animals. I guess two questions. What's the basis for that inclusion of animals? And, is sentience part of how you think about that? And secondly, what do you think about going beyond the animal, thinking about biocentric perspectives on plants and fungi, and even ecocentric perspectives on ecosystems, rocks, rivers, and trees, and how they relate? Why should we include animals in our moral consideration? And what do you think of going further?
It goes back a little bit to what I was saying about, how do we pitch our ethical theories? Do we pitch them in terms of similarity, difference, or something else? Matthew Calarco is a great person to read on that, actually. So he comes up with the third option, which is like indistinction. So he's kind of trying to criticize both similarity and difference approaches and come up with something slightly different. So I suppose we could slot sentience views in that similarity side of things. And some people might argue, well, that's inescapable, that we're going to kind of draw upon similarity perspectives in terms of producing an animal ethic. But there's quite a lot of criticism within critical animal studies around the kind of anthropocentricness of doing that, because it's like, we're basing the ethical standard on the human, that kind of thing. So it's really important to kind of think, well, what might be, it might be really important to kind of delve into those difference arguments as well, to think about, well, the capacities that other animals have that we don't have. And that in itself is a nice exercise in decentering the human. So, whether we're talking about, echolocation or something like that, it could be lots of different things. And that helps us, kind of create a sense of awe in terms of the other life forms, other non-human animals and so on. But even with I guess like one argument I was reading, I think it was from Matthew Calarco, that he was saying in terms of the similarity argument, well, why do we start the similarity argument with human capacities and then try to extend that out to other species? What if we kind of went in the other direction? So try to do it in a way in which we looked at some of the, I don't want to use the word capacities, but that kind of thing, or properties of other species, and work our way back to humans in some way. I
think an evolutionary story can help us do that as well. I think it can help us give an understanding and a rationale for sentience without having to refer to humans at all. But so that can be one way maybe into that. But yeah, because I agree. There are some real risks with the sentience idea, and you can see it in the way some people apply it, because it can be done in quite an anthropocentric way. It can be, we're sentient, and it becomes a how like us are you test that we, the powerful humans, then apply to others, and we deign to grant them rights or moral consideration if they're enough like us, right? And you can feel the echoes for how that's worked with intrahuman ethics as well. And I guess I've come to think of it less as, a capacity or a characteristic that you might assess in another, and it's more about whether that being is another at all, i.e., it becomes another way of saying, does that entity have its own perspective, its own values, and in a way that's another definition of sentience that isn't anthropocentric. Beings seem to have had that for millions of years, billions of years before humans, certainly hundreds of millions of years before humans even came on the scene, and we're a vanishingly tiny percentage of the sentient beings that exist today. So I think it can be a powerful way of rejecting anthropocentrism, but there are risks there because it can be applied in that, it's still human-centered approach.
It's a nice point to say that sentience preceded the human. I think that's a valuable thing to acknowledge.
Yeah, I mean, and I've had some fascinating interviews with people who looked at the evolutionary story, people like Mark Solms and Walter Veet, and I haven't spoken to them yet, but I'd love to, Jablonka and Ginsberg and so on. But there's a cluster of different people who have different thoughts about how sentience and also consciousness evolved, and their idea seems to be that it was probably around the Precambrian at some point. So we're talking hundreds of millions of years before we even turned on the scene, and it was probably quite a simple sort of sentient experience, but it came out of the adaptive value of a mobile, simple animal wanting to go towards the good stuff and away from the bad. Right? That was that capacity to feel, how am I doing now on a moment by moment basis, and to use that as a way of driving decisions that help keep you alive. That's the basis of their stories. That's what consciousness and sentience really is. So it's been around for a long while. Yeah.
I'll make another point, which will probably take us into the second question. So I think post-humanism is quite good at complicating first question as well. So it problematizes the idea that humans, or indeed other animals, are a discrete entity, and that we're actually better seen as kind of, in our case, walking assemblages of multi-species. So, there are all the things that are living on us and all the things that are living in us.
I think it's true that most of the cells in us aren't actually human cells. Is that right? They're like the microbiome and so on. I don't know if that's an accurate thing, but it's the indicative sort of the complexity of our organism.
There are aspects like that, like mitochondria in all of our cells. That was formerly something else. Yeah, it's pretty fascinating, sort of the cell history, if you like. So another thing I'm suspicious of in some utilitarian ethics is this kind of individualism. And so that kind of idea that there's a discrete human. There isn't a discrete human. where our bodies are ecologies, and we live in relationship with many other species, both literally, but also in terms of how we conceive of ourselves. So the human has been defined historically against other animals. So there's that conceptual and material aspect to the way in which there is not a discrete human. It's part of the kind of mythology of humanism to suppose that there are these kind of discrete entities.
And one risk that I can see in that, whether it's applied to human or non-human animals, because I absolutely see the value of recognizing the reality of our physical being and our interconnectedness and the complexity, and the fact that some of the concepts we apply to ourselves and others are, more arbitrary than we might think, and they are just a conceptual thing that doesn't necessarily map that well to reality. And I'm quite in favor of some of the ideas about challenging individualism and individuality as being a sort of such a deeply important canonical thing. But it feels to me like there is a risk that if we give up on the idea of the individual, then is there a risk that there therefore is no moral patient? There is no being that can be the subject of a harm. And and there are some philosophies that seem to take that path, and it can become a sort of well, ultimately, it's all just physics churning away, and there are a load of interconnected systems, and I don't really exist as a self. And, and you almost end up with an ethical flattening where you've lost the subjects of injustice as entities in our ontology. I don't know if there's a risk there.
It's a good point. And I think that, there's happy ground to be found within there. I was thinking of some of the advocates of addressing wild animal suffering who are take a kind of anti-predation view. And that sometimes overlaps with transhumanism, the idea that we should kind of engineer nature so that it no longer has predation. And that seemed to me like this is like classic utilitarian individualism, which is trying to use human power to somehow bring about a kind of ethical fantasy of a zero suffering world. And I don't think you can get rid of all suffering. And I think suffering is part of life. But again, I'm not saying that to then justify everything. Suffering is part of life, therefore slaughterhouses are just amazing.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm obviously not saying that. But,
because there is a danger of an appeal to nature fallacy that, American ranchers will use to explain, why they kill cows. Yeah. So, yeah.
Anybody who's lost a parent or a relative or something will know, has had a close experience with death.
Yeah.
Will understand that suffering is itself a measure of our emotional relationships in our life. And so there is that sense in which suffering, but also, just thinking, and again, I realize completely that this is all about ongoing tensions between animal ethics and environmental ethics. But if you take an animal ethics view, like I think like David Pearce, transhumanist, utilitarian, who basically wants to.
So he was my sixth interview, actually.
Right,
one of my really early ones. Yeah.
I should listen back to that. But I long not supported his view. So I just think that some non-human animal species have as part of their nature the need to predate on other species, and that is something that has to be recognized. We are fortunate in that we don't have to do that, but we often use that model of predation to kind of construct a falsely anthropocentric and hierarchical view of the human. So seeing naturalizing meat eating through the predation of other species and so on. So that's all.
Can we recognize the need for the autonomy and the predator animal to follow its natural life course and its natural behaviors and fulfill its needs, and we can give that some moral salience. Can we hold on to that while still recognizing the salience of the suffering and stress and trauma of the prey?
I think so. I mean, it's not,
because I was interested in your because I do find this subject of wild animal suffering, wild animal ethics really fascinating, and I've had some conversations with people like Carl Johansson and others around the topic, and it's a really complex, difficult topic. But I sometimes think that because of the difficulty, people use that as a justification for arbitrarily excluding wild animals from moral consideration completely. So it feels like quite a blind spot in veganism for me as well, because obviously, the textbook definition of veganism is primarily about avoiding us causing exploitation, suffering, and death, and in practical terms, through a boycott. But that says nothing about the salience of suffering or pain or death that isn't caused by humans. So some people will say, well, we just need to end the human-caused suffering. And yes, there's a load of other suffering in nature, but we shouldn't have the hubris to intervene. And again, sometimes there's an appeal to nature fallacy that people naively think that anything natural is good. And so they sort of back away. And I guess my appeal is, look, let's recognize the ethical challenges and the difficulties and the risks there, but that's not an excuse from excluding wild animals from our moral consideration. They should still be morally considered as sentient beings in the same way as an animal in a farm is. That doesn't mean the answer is easy. Doesn't mean there's necessarily something we can or should do, right? You might still conclude that intervening in some way doesn't make sense, but let's not exclude them from our consideration.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that. I mean, in my book, chapter 3 of my book is basically devoted to looking at all the impacts that climate change is already having on non-human animals, and mostly that is focused on so-called wild animals. And so, you could argue, that is ultimately human-caused suffering or capitalism cause suffering.
Yeah, and I sometimes use a thought experiment to say, look, even in intrahuman ethics, if there's a natural disaster that wasn't caused by humans at all, we don't just say, well, unlucky, you're under the rubble from the earthquake, but we didn't cause it, right? We still think you matter morally, your suffering matters, and you can feel some moral pull to help out. Whereas, even many vegans, if you talk about suffering in the wild, will take a very different approach. There's no, absolutely not. We don't touch it. We don't go near it. We don't even think about it. And so I find that a bit of an artificial distinction, which again is quite anthropocentric in a way. It's odd, like a different ethical system applied to non-humans as to humans. And it seems to be, back to our earlier question, much more concerned with human virtue than an empathic concern with others, which again it's odd because how can you call mainstream veganism anthropocentric? But in a way, it is very concerned with human-caused suffering, not necessarily with the experiences and the values and the perspectives of all beings. So yeah, there's an interesting dynamic there.
Let me make a couple of points. Well, yeah, I think the topic of wild animal suffering will become so much bigger soon because of climate change. Yeah. But I think that's important. There's already a lot of talk of relocating animals and this kind of thing because of the extinction threats and so on. So that is not going to go away. And I totally applaud the way in which sort of work on wild animal suffering has come into quite a lot of prominence recently within the writing. But yeah, it's just the kind of the transhumanist side that I have an objection to, just because I think it's sort of anti-ecological.
And I think there are different flavors with transhumanism as well. And frustratingly, it does seem like a lot of transhumanism seems to be more in the sort of Elon Musk, tech bro mode of super hubris, techno-optimism, control, dominance, and often quite a lot of elitism, where it's more about, it's not really transforming for the benefit of everybody. It's more about me and my select mates managed to go off to Mars or whatever it is, right? So that's the sort of discourse center of gravity about transhumanism. Whereas I think David Pearce's version, and you may well still disagree with it, and there's things about it I disagree with, does feel like it comes from a genuine place of compassion and humility, even though it's still, sort of part of the transhumanist space. But yeah, unfortunately, it seems to be more dominated by the former model, which I would object to just as strongly as you. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's transhumanism has been referred to as a kind of hyperhumanism. I did some work on that some time ago. I was just thinking, say in my garden, I saw somebody's cat chasing a mouse, which I have witnessed, and I have intervened in that situation. But then I'm thinking, well, that's a domesticated companion animal trying to predate upon a wild animal. That companion animal has food, whatever their companion human is choosing to feed them, and therefore I feel that kind of attempt by myself to intervene and save the mouse is somehow justified. But yeah, I think there's definitely lots of complexity in that area, but I think there's lots of dangers as well.
Yeah, too right. So we should come on to the final question in the time we've got. I could talk to you all day, but I guess the final question is, how do we make a better world? And you can go broader if you like, but it would be really interesting, given the book, to zero in on the climate and the environmental space. And again, you're criticizing, and I think absolutely rightly, criticizing the sort of classical environmentalism and trying to take things in a more radical and deeper and more powerful direction. But I don't know if you wanted to lay out your perspective on that problem, because my amateurish reading of it, you could think about these crises in terms of the impacts they're having, the potential causes of those problems, and the potential solutions and ways forward we might find. And our anthropocentric response to it, which even most environmentalists or supposedly ecocentrists think you scratch the surface and it's still very anthropocentric. One seems to radically underestimate the impacts because, as you pointed out already, there are free-ranging wild animals, there are farmed animals. It's not just about impacts on humans. It means we misunderstand the causes as well. So our analysis of how we've ended up where we are is led off track. And it also means we're quite often missing some really powerful potential solutions that could really help us, if not fix the problem, but at least mitigate it or take us in a different direction. And some of those solutions we're just, completely ignoring. So I don't know if you wanted to lay out the big picture that you talk about in your book about, the nature of the problem and, how you think we should try and address it and take things forward.
Sure. Well, there's a huge gap between official climate policy and the misunderstanding of what the climate crisis, there's an overlap between the misunderstanding and the inadequacy of climate policy, because if you read, really quite basic social science on climate change, there's a kind of consensus that the climate crisis is in part a crisis of capitalism. It's an inability of capitalism to kind of understand that it's undermining its own conditions of possibility by degrading ecology and so on. So within the social sciences, it's quite a mainstream view that the climate crisis is a crisis of capitalism. So that's already a long way away from governments and policymakers who don't want to even acknowledge that, because it would be to acknowledge that their faith in economic growth and neoliberalism are heavily misplaced.
And just as a quick question on that, would you, how much difference would there be between seeing it as a crisis of capitalism and a crisis of industrialization? Because I guess there are some instances of non-capitalist industrialization that have also been pretty environmentally destructive and brutal. Or is that not really a distinction that's worth making because of the predominance of the capitalist system?
I think it's a distinction that is often aired when we talk about capitalism and climate change, or indeed capitalism and human-animal relations, because people say, well, when we had communist Russia and yeah, which is like, unfortunately, I don't think it's a very sophisticated argument. So obviously, yeah, things like anthropocentrism as an ideology preceded capitalism. That's for sure. But there's the argument in the book, which I'm basically developing things from eco-socialist writers, will basically make the argument there's an inherent tendency within capitalism to accumulate capital. That is its rationale. And so that's like a juggernaut which will devour ecologies, devour non-human animals.
A sort of unstoppable force that, relentless.
Yeah, and that kind of the logic of capital accumulation hasn't been present in other. We've never really seen, like, I'm a big advocate of rejecting the idea that we've ever really seen a communist society. But anyway, so yeah, there's definitely an argument within the book which is that there are aspects of capitalism which are uniquely damaging, and the kind of consumerism and of it as well. So I'm adding in the book, basically, it's not just a crisis of capitalism, it's also a crisis of the very idea and ideology of anthropocentrism, and that really needs to be grasped. But of course, governments won't even grasp that it's a crisis of capitalism. But it's also a crisis of colonialism, of global North power. And it's also a crisis of patriarchy as well, because it's the way in which we still live in a very male-dominated world, and ideas of masculinity feed into this overconsumption and feed into this disavowal of care for other animals and ecologies and so on. So, yeah, historically, there's been a very productive relationship between masculinity, colonialism, and capitalism, but also anthropocentrism. So,
and those links are absolutely fascinating across a lot of the human world, and in a way, the animal agriculture industry is like a almost perfect encapsulation of where those things come together. So, the role of animal agriculture in part driving the colonial land hunger. Again, the roles of patriarchy and hierarchy and othering, and the acceptability of violence, and there's just so many rich themes there, and those play through into even modern politics now, where the ideas of people explaining that, the core American values are Bible, bullets, and beef. It's like the resonance is fascinating and quite disturbing.
Yeah, so capitalism essentially supercharged anthropocentric ideology. I found it incredibly useful. And, the fact that the land that is used for animal agriculture now is the equivalent of all of the Americas, North, Central, and Latin, South America.
It's mind blowing. Yeah.
That just tells you about the transformation. And I'm arguing that, what we call in critical animal studies as the animal industrial complex, that is like a really important dimension of capitalism. And mainstream sociological theorists of capitalism don't even acknowledge that. So
it's like another massive taboo, isn't it?
Yeah. So I'm firing criticisms in all directions in the book, and essentially following properly post-humanist intersectional understanding of the climate crisis. And, I'm also criticizing the climate justice movement for being anthropocentric, for not including human-animal relations. I'm arguing towards the end of the book. So I have this final chapter where I look at plant-based capitalism, kind of critical look at plant-based capitalism, and arguing that we need an intersectional understanding of veganism because it has so much more critical purchase on what's going on and what are the real causes of the climate and biodiversity crises. So one of the sort of key arguments towards the end, which I openly confess is a very utopian position, but I make the case that the animal advocacy movement or the animal rights movement, whatever you want to call it, shouldn't just be making the case for the decommodification of non-human animals. It should be also making the case strongly for the decommodification of food as well. So food shouldn't be something that is on the market. It shouldn't be something that we pay for. And then that even though that's highly utopian, it makes really important links between the animal rights movement and social class movements and food justice movements.
And that would seem like a deeply radical idea to many people. But in the same ways you might think about other things, towards the base of Maslow's hierarchy, and we think of the role of the state in, addressing those, and whether it's universal healthcare or whether it's, welfare systems, or, and again, there are flaws in all of these, of course. But at least the idea of some sort of baseline provision, and your suggestion, I guess, is that, food in some sense should be included in that. It's something that, no one should want for.
I mean, I think it's a basic socialist idea that those things that we need, like housing and food and education, should be outside of the market, and that they should be shared and commonly owned, and those sorts of things. And even though it sounds utopian, I also kind of outline the ways in which we already have practices which do decommodify food. And some of those are also vegan practices as well, in terms of growing your own food and even I guess not that I want to advocate for food banks, but the idea of a food bank does decommodify food, and it does. So, you could take the idea of the food bank and turn it into something progressive and accessible to a wider, make it
rather than it being a sort of desperate stopgap.
Yeah. So,
and does that mean you, in your utopian end state, you do still see space for markets and capitalism in other spaces outside of the provision of certain basics, or would your vision be that we need a completely different system?
I think the latter, ultimately. I mean, I think it's a good place to start. I mean, it's only recently that the education system has become more marketized, and so maybe it's easier to make those arguments for things which are more definable in terms of need. But I think the problem with the market is that it doesn't curtail consumerism. And if we just have rampant, uncontrolled consumerism, it's always going to have a bad environmental impact. So where profit is before human health, human animal relations, and environmental health, then, we're always going to struggle to live in a society which is just. So, yeah, I think ultimately I'd like to kind of, I subscribe to that view that we should abolish capitalism. But it's only recently that you've been allowed to say that again. So it's, but I feel that it shouldn't be a taboo to say that. I think that, why should we limit our kind of imaginary of what the future could look like? Because, it's clearly not working. It's productive of inequality, and it's productive of undermining the conditions of existence for humans and other animals. And so I think it's rightly appropriate that we, move beyond that.
Yeah, thank you. And I guess there's so much debate about this, and we can't get into it now, but a couple of the classic challenges or concerns people have about moving away from that system is one is a problem of information. So they said, well, look, we need the market because through a sort of mysterious process of billions of different interactions and expressions of value, it enables us to work out who needs what, where, when, and so on. And without that system, it's very hard for us to work out what to produce and what and how to operate. And there's a twin concern, which is that as a result maybe of some of that complexity, that challenge, that a socialist or even a communist system might then drift into an authoritarianism where, there's a top-down control that is trying to address that problem, and that can end up being quite authoritarian and so on and so forth. What do you have a sense in your utopian vision about how you can sort of manage those risks of complexity in information and the risks of, authoritarian control as opposed to something more democratic?
Yeah. So, one of the problems is capitalism constructs its own needs for people.
Needs we didn't even realize we had.
Yeah, information about what people need is like an interesting one. But I think the internet clearly is providing information and data and so on. So I don't think that's a huge problem. Obviously, we've never really. I feel that no country has ever really explored democratic forms of socialism or communism, and so there has to be some kind of collective decision making around these key decisions. But I think democracy, which we don't have, so we make the assumption that we live in a democracy, but there are lots of different ways in which we don't. And for me, a democracy is predicated upon a really strong and robust education system. Unfortunately, we don't have that. So we don't really have informed citizens. We have citizens who are, many of whom are apathetic and disenfranchised and disillusioned about the so-called democratic process. We have the media that control the political system in certain respects. I sometimes list them. There's lots of different ways in which we don't live in a very good democracy.
Money and politics, and
our voting system, and lobbying.
First past the post, and
yeah. And I even in the last chapter of the book, I talk about some of the ways in which we need to understand the political nature of the economy and how it shuts down transition away from meat cultures and so on. So yeah, it's really kind of. There's a naivety to think that we live in a democracy, or at least a good one. And so I think to have that kind of alternative system, we would need to have a much more robust education system. But you could argue it's purposively underfunded. And yeah, I think, there's not many societies which make a good job of properly investing in their education systems. And when they do, it tends to be around the technical types of education rather than critical thinking.
I would love your thoughts on, because I find this space, the education space, fascinating. I've been doing some work in the UK amateurishly recently on it too. What would that education system look like? What would be the principles or the themes or the approach you'd love to see there as a sort of lever for change? And
comes up a lot in both my teaching and research. So just to take the issue of climate, we don't have very good climate education in our schools. It's really, it's something. It's been a bone of contention recently. Lots of criticism of our government for having mediocre climate education. So we don't have good environmental education. We don't have good climate education. Within critical animal studies now, there's an area called critical animal pedagogy. So there are education academics arguing that we need to bring critical thinking around human-animal relations into schools and universities. That should be part of or connected to environmental education and climate education. So there's lots of good initiatives happening about that, but again, the pace of change is incredibly slow. Yeah, so the Vegan Society is doing things on that, and other organizations too.
I interviewed Laura Chetner a while ago about vegan education, and my just guest in the episode I've just published with Zoe Weil from the Institute of Humane Education are doing some really interesting work in the States too. So Zoe's been doing stuff on that for a long time, and it is about a vision for social change. It is about completely redoing the social fabric. It's about redoing the education system, but it's also about, and this is another focus of the second half of the book, kind of taking apart
the fabric of meat cultures and trying to kind of create new practices and create new social networks and social relationships. It's a long drawn out process, but I point to some of the ways in which vegan practice is gradually becoming embedded into the social fabric of society. Yeah, and there's a lot in the second half of the book around theories of change and sociological theories of change. And I'm trying to come up with a potential approach that could be effective, but clearly it's a complex one. Nobody has really come up with something that works yet, but it's trying to move what is a very, minoritarian practice into becoming something which is even, I think society would be incredibly different even if just 10% of people were vegan. So I think, there would be perhaps a kind of domino effect if we got up to a certain 10, 15%, because we also tend to be quite loud and audible and so on. So, which is really important. I don't think passive veganism is ever going to be helpful in terms of achieving change. So I think probably there's an onus on everybody to be quite activist.
I guess as a closing question, how does that leave you feeling? Because on the one hand, the raw materials of sentientism, the sort of philosophy about caring about every sentient being, is a value that I think most humans pretty much have deep down. In a way, most humans have actually got vegan values, theoretically. So that gives me some hope that we can basically tap into that latent ethic and release it in various ways. But as you've been talking about, when you think about the challenges of human psychology and sociology and the stories that drive our culture and political will and power and, cultural inertia, it's a terrible dead weight to try and lift. And, your book is criticizing so many different aspects and different angles. It feels like it's a tough battle. But how does it leave you feeling overall in terms of our chance to move these types of agendas forward?
Yeah, just to echo what you said, I said on the Vegan Society podcast recently that, everybody has a belief in animal rights. It's just that there is that huge social barrier between extending it from companion animals to other social constructions of animals.
Yeah, almost everybody has broken anthropocentrism already.
In some way.
To some extent, right?
Yeah. And therefore, when governments and institutions try to label animal rights as some kind of extremist belief, that's really easy to undermine that it's extremist. And, the common tactic is to then say, well, look at a slaughterhouse. That is the reality of extremism. And to kind of shine the mirror back on the majority of people that, well, is this not kind of some strange sadistic behavior, given that all these vegans are now demonstrating in their daily lives that they're flourishing by not consuming animal products, either from food or in other ways of consume. So that's really powerful. I do talk towards the end of the book and in the concluding chapter, I do reflect on the whole kind of optimism, pessimism kind of themes. And I say that basically, I kind of play with it a little bit because often books try to end with a kind of rosy, optimistic message. And I kind of, I want to sort of hack into that and say, well, actually, things are really bad, and we need to deal with the fact that they're really bad, and there are real grounds for pessimism. On the other hand, there are also avenues into optimism as well. And I essentially argue that, in terms of, being part of networks of people who are doing positive work and building those networks and making the kind of community that your podcast is bringing into life, strengthening the links between different social actors within that community and, being part of what is a really important social movement, that is where people can get their optimism from. But also further than that, there's optimism if we can bring veganism into, or bring other social movements into veganism. And that is the real promise, where we can make ourselves relevant to, all those other key movements for peace and non-violence, for, pro-feminist and, any movement which is against social inequality, and any movement which is against racism and these kinds of things. It really needs to be part of a broader vision. And I also end the book with quite a sort of critical nudge towards the left for not including human-animal relations within their vision. So
yeah, the dissonance is so stark, right? If you talk to someone who's on the far right who explicitly has an in-group, out-group, might makes right philosophy, at least they're being consistent when it comes to non-human animals. But for anyone else, what is going on? It's such a simple extension of concepts that people are deeply invested in, whether it's, oppression, violence, solidarity, injustice, discrimination, right? It's all sort of there, right?
That frustrates me. We need to keep pushing at that. We also need to keep pushing at our fellow vegans who are against the kind of thinking about gender and race and class, because I think they are equally problematic. So yeah, there are, in spite, we're dealing with a real, a problem which is incredibly difficult to solve, and one that's really interconnected with lots of other problems, but turn it into the cause of your life, because that's what we need to do, and it actually gives somebody meaning to their lives to actually be involved in something like this. It's better than just watching TV all the time.
You're right. Well, it's a great call to action. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And your book is an important intervention trying to nudge us in that direction. So, well, thank you. It's been a brilliant conversation. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you. Is there anything else you wanted to add in? I think we've answered all the questions, really. We just got to go and do it now.
Yeah, probably, but it's probably lots. Like have an extended edition, but hopefully I'll run into you in person one day and we can keep talking. Yeah.
I would love to continue the conversation. And in the meantime, how can people follow you, buy the book? I'll include links in the show notes, of course. But
yeah, so I'm on Twitter. I'll keep calling it Twitter. But I have a website which is just .com after my name, and probably more important than that, look at the website of my research center, which is the Center for Human Animal Studies, abbreviated to CFAS, CFHAS, which is part of Edgehill University. So yeah, that's probably the best ways to kind of keep in touch.
Cool. And I'm hoping to have one of your colleagues, Heather Marshall, come and join me for an episode at some point as well. So we'll see if we can get that scheduled. Yeah.
Excellent. Yeah. Well, we did the joint podcast for the Vegan Society.
Of course. Yeah.
So and in terms of having a discussion focused on the education side of things, it'd be great.
Absolutely. Well, it's been brilliant. Thank you so much for being a guest on Sentientism. Yeah, and please do stay in touch.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Thanks very much.